And I bring you warm greetings from Ghana and generally the lower latitudes. I do so on my own behalf and on behalf of the Afrobarometer board, management, and staff, and then on behalf of our network members spread across some 40 African countries. I also bring you thanks to the government and people of Norway for recognizing the value of the Afrobarometer's work and backing that up with generous financial support, and for providing a forum like this for us to share and use the insights of that work to make the world safer, hopefully, and more prosperous and more democratic. I've been asked to speak about Africa's democratization projects, current trends, challenges, and opportunities. But in effect, it won't be me speaking. It will also be the voice of over 385,000 ordinary Africans speaking to Afrobarometer field survey workers over 2 decades. All we do as Afrobarometer is to ask the questions, give them the mic, and aggregate the data. I imagine most people in this audience have seen the headlines: military coups in West Africa, urban warfare in East Africa, attempts at third-term presidencies all over the continent. But to anyone paying attention, democracy appears to be under stress on the continent. But what lies beneath this? And what are the sentiments and behaviors driving these changes? And most important, what can we, Africans as well as friends of Africa, do to strengthen and sustain the long-term trend towards democratic governance and its attendant welfare gains that Africa has started to experience in the late 1990s and 2000s, but sadly beginning to lose? It is clear that African democratization projects do face severe headwinds. Military coups are back in vogue, especially in the Sahel region. Others are using quasi-constitutional third terms to extend their rule. Hopes for democratic openings in the Sudan and Ethiopia have been dashed by the return to armed conflict. And even in Africa's star democracies, such as my own country, Ghana, we are seeing some backsliding through winner-takes-all politics and the resultant do-or-die efforts to win power. Little wonder that Ghana experienced its first major incidents of electoral violence in 2020, with 8 people losing their lives. Meanwhile, our parliament is on the verge of bastardizing individual rights by passing a legislation to criminalize homosexuality and prescribe punishment for individual LGBTQ persons as well as their allies. Afrobarometer surveys do show some slippage in popular support for democracy in Africa. Over the past decade, support has declined sharply in several countries, including Mali and Burkina Faso. But perhaps more of a surprise to some, South Africa too has shown slippage, and more of that later. Meanwhile, aversion to military rule has weakened by an average of 9 percentage points across 31 countries for which we have over time data. Indeed, in our most recent surveys conducted between 2021 and 2023, covering 39 countries, an average of slightly more than half of Africans said they were willing to welcome military intervention, quote, when elected leaders abuse power for their own ends. Notably, that acceptance of military rule is more prevalent among younger Africans, making the promotion of democratic government that much more urgent. Of course, these indicators may suggest that things are not looking good for the future of democracy in Africa. But there is actually plenty to be hopeful about. Let's start with Liberia. Many of you know the turmoil that country experienced in the 80s and 90s. But after its highly competitive presidential elections last November, then incumbent President George Weah made a gracious speech conceding defeat to his rival, Joseph Boakai. And through this act of statesmanship, he paved the way for the country's second electoral turnover and a transition to take place just last week or a couple of weeks ago. But my hope actually goes beyond elections. Across the continent, young people are defying government repression to demand social justice. We saw that 4 years ago with the EndSARS protest against police brutality in Nigeria. And in Senegal, the youth-led opposition has pressured the president to abandon his plans to seek a third term in this year's elections. The growth in the number of countries in which we are able to conduct Afrobarometer surveys is another bit of the good news to share. The first set of surveys in 1999-2000 could cover only a dozen countries, the most politically open African countries at the time. We are now able to conduct the same surveys and disseminate their politically sensitive findings in more than 3 times as many countries. Most important from our standpoint, that people say they want democracy. In our surveys across the continent, Africans have consistently expressed their desire to live under governments that are democratic and accountable. In the latest round, a continental average of 2/3 of respondents expressed a preference for democracy over any other system of government. Clearly, popular demand for democracy remains strong. And by the way, even more resounding majorities, even where completely rejected the idea of military rule, the idea of one-man rule, and the idea of single-party rule. This support for democracy for Africans is not only limited to notional democracy. Africans also do strongly endorse the norms and institutions as well as practices associated with democratic governance. Significant majorities want to choose their political leaders through the ballot box, that's 75%, and to have parliamentary oversight over the executive, and to place constitutional limits on presidential tenure. Even more encouragingly, over the past decade, we have seen increases in support for media freedom by 11 percentage points, in the prioritization of accountable governance over effective governance by 7 percentage points, and in the demand for the president to comply with court decisions. All of this is to say that despite the recent turbulence, Africans continue to support democracy, they continue to value accountable governance. So we conclude for now that what is testing Africans' faith in democracy, per our data, is the meager supply of democracy, which we measure with citizens' ratings of their country as democratic and their level of satisfaction with the way democracy works in their country. These democracy side indicators, I am afraid to say, have persistently fallen short of citizens' expectations and have been declining since 2014. The proportion rating their country as a democracy has dropped by a modest 3 percentage points on the average, while those expressing satisfaction with the way democracy works has dropped an average of 5 percentage points. And we see steep declines in several countries, top among them Mali, little surprise here, but also Botswana, Mauritius, and South Africa. Our data suggests that These declines occur mainly when a country's leaders have failed to deliver or are seen as perverting the democratic political order. For example, going back to the South African case, the Zondo Commission's report on state capture made harrowing revelations of corruption under former President Zuma. But to date, there have been no significant sanctions or corrective measures. No wonder South Africans' preference for democracy has dropped by 21 percentage points between 2014 and 2022. There also seems to be a correlation between drops in levels of satisfaction with democracy along with drops in levels of opposition to military rule, as well as vulnerability and an increase in vulnerability to extra-constitutional regime change. So such drops had occurred in Mali and Burkina for several years before the recent coups in those countries. These findings suggest that the African democratic challenge is more of a problem of demand rather than that of supply. I wanted to say a few things about what is driving the decline in supply of democracy despite the citizens' expressed desire for the same. But I'll just mention a few. They have essentially to do with two factors. On the internal and regional front, there is a problem of lack of pushback from peer leaders across Africa. So unlike the 2000s, a little bit into the 90s, there was the AU and ECOWAS will push back against these undemocratic changes. But these days, you don't get that so much, and what is offered is often ineffective. Also, it's the case that the continent lacks the kinds of leaders it used to have in the 2000s, especially the President Kufuor's and Obasanjo's and Ellen Johnson Sirleaf's, who robustly championed the cause of Africa's democratic renaissance. But the West too bears some responsibility. It has stepped back from promoting democratization in favor of countering China, fighting violent extremism, and stemming migration, and indeed has returned to looking at African countries simply as markets and security buffers. Meanwhile, China and Russia have stepped in. As they pursue Africa's resources, new markets, and diplomatic influence, they create enabling factors that deepen autocratic trends and political repression. Unlike the West, they impose no demands for transparency, accountability, or democratic rights. Rather, their opaque lending practices and collusive deals thrive where independent media and civil society are weak and institutional checks and balances are ineffective. So to the final set of comments, what then should be done to address the democracy supply gap and therefore help Africa to sustain and deepen popular faith in democracy for its peoples? As we all know, democracy requires constant nurturing. We need to fortify civil society's resilience and rekindle its energies. The gains of the past had come from civil society's commitment to ensuring the integrity of elections, helping to enact laws for best practices in good governance, and holding governments accountable. Unfortunately, international support for this work has waned. Norad has a timely opportunity to step in and help push against autocratic trends and democratic backsliding. In the same way and for the same reason, Norway, the European Union, and the West can support initiatives at the level of the African Union and Africa regional economic communities that are pro-human rights, pro-democracy, pro-accountable governance, pro-clean elections. So, for instance, ECOWAS has been seeking to make two-term presidential tenure a West African democratic norm. This process needs support to achieve adoption, ratification, and domestication. Similarly, the African Union and ECOWAS need support for implementation and enforcement of their policies of zero tolerance for coups and unconstitutional changes in government. Norad and its allies should significantly boost the democratic governance component of their development cooperation programs with Africa. You should factor anti-corruption and local non-state actor participation in your bilateral security sector arrangements with African governments and regional bodies. This will foster citizen buy-in, program accountability, and sustainability. And it goes without saying that such steps align with the core values of Norway and other democratic Western societies. And of course, they will contribute to the realization of Africans' consistently reaffirmed aspiration to live under governments that are democratic and accountable. Thank you for your attention, and may democratic governance live in Africa with your help. Thank you.